President, are we in a quorum call?
We are not.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, for months now, American families have struggled with the growing burden of inflation. New data shows just how bad things have gotten. Last month, consumer prices increased at the fastest pace in 40 years. Now, I'd like to take a little walk down memory lane, Mr. President. The last time the American people endured price spikes like this, "Eye of the Tiger" was one of the top songs on the radio. I'm sure the senator from Delaware remembers that very well. The world had yet to be introduced to the Nintendo and Mario, and consumers were anxiously awaiting the release of the first cell phone, which weighed in at a whopping 2 pounds. I remember those unwieldy telephones well. Over the last 4 decades, of course, a lot has changed. And I'm not just talking about technology. The attacks of September the 11th, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Great Recession. Even during the first year of the pandemic, inflation didn't come close to hitting the heights that it has today. Between March 2020 and February 2021, the inflation rate never topped 2%. There were countless reasons for us to be optimistic. We had 3 highly effective vaccines with shots going into the arms of millions of people every day. Schools were reopening. Employees were returning to work, and the American people began to discover a new semblance of normal post-COVID. But the administration ignored all of this progress because they had another plan in mind. They seized on what one House Democrat described as a, quote, tremendous opportunity to restructure things to fit their vision. They crafted a nearly $2 trillion piece of legislation that included their ideological priorities and tried to brand it as necessary pandemic relief. But we know that only about 10% of that $2 trillion expenditure actually went to COVID-19. Less than 1% went for vaccine. What it did include was backdoor funding for Planned Parenthood, a blank check for mismanaged union pensions plans, money for climate justice. It was easy to see through the COVID relief facade. Well, as our colleagues pushed this bill forward, they ignored warning signs from leading economists that this kind of spending, chasing limited goods and services, could trigger inflation. Larry Summers, who served as Secretary of Treasury during the Obama administration, even predicted that this package could, and I quote, set off inflationary pressures of a kind we have not seen in a generation. Our colleagues couldn't be convinced to change course, and look where we are now as a result. We're experiencing inflation of a kind that we've not seen in a generation. Last month, prices jumped a whopping 6.8% from the previous year, marking the 6th consecutive month in which inflation has topped 5%. Now, when concerns were raised about this, the Federal Reserve claimed that this inflation was transitory. In other words, it was a passing moment. But the longer and longer inflation continues to rise and continue to be a problem, it's looking less and less transitory and more frightening. The reason it's frightening, of course, is because particularly people on fixed incomes are seeing less and less buying power for each dollar they spend. It is, some have said, a hidden tax on the American people, which describes its impact very well. Well, month after month, the data has now demonstrated that this is not just transitory, and it isn't just a blip on the radar of our economy. Inflation is running much hotter than expected, and things are not expected to cool down anytime soon. As families prepare for the Christmas holiday season, they're bracing their wallets for higher than normal expenses. And one of the biggest hits is for grocery bills, hardly something optional. Breakfast on Christmas morning is sure to cost a lot more than it did just a year ago. Egg prices are up 8%. Bacon costs a whopping 21% more than it did just a year ago. Dinner, it won't be any cheaper either. Prices are up for everything from ham to salad dressing to pie. Cooking that meal will cost you a lot more too. Electricity prices are up 6.5%, and anyone cooking on a gas range will shell out 25% more than they did last year. If you're traveling to see your family, extended family this year, you better start saving for it now. Gas prices are up a whopping 58%, the largest increase since 1980. Of course, this ignores the rising costs of gifts sitting under the Christmas tree, if you can get them, because of broken and delayed supply chains. So the new cars, the washing machines, and sofas countless families have purchased this year, all of those cost more. You would think that our Democratic colleagues that are proposing another $5 trillion in spending under the so-called BBB, or Build Back Better bill, you would think they would view this as with caution and back off of their plans, or at least tap the brakes for a second round of unnecessary spending. Unfortunately, that does not appear to be the case. In fact, the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Schumer, is trying to double down on this next round of inflationary spending. We know that every trick in the book has been employed to try to make the BBB, the Build Back Better, Build Back Broke, Build Back Bad, Build Back Bankrupt, you call it what you will. But our Democratic colleagues have used every gimmick in the book to make the price of this bill look as small as possible. Of course, they started with the chairman of the Budget Committee. Senator Sanders wanted to spend $6 trillion more. That was pared down to $3.5 trillion. Now they claim it's only $1.75 trillion. In order to achieve that number, they've gamed the tax code to fund part of the bill while handing out tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires in relief for state and local taxes. And they've strategically chosen start dates, sunsets, and expiration dates that make these programs appear deceptively to cost less. One of our colleagues acknowledged that this is disingenuous advertising, and even told Senator Graham, the senator from South Carolina, that he knew that this score that they were promoting was full of gimmicks. Of course, that's a lot different than the president himself, who said this bill will cost zero. Now, everybody knows that's not true, but there had been some debate about what the honest score would be, even with all the gimmicks. But if the temporary provisions were extended, as we all know they would be, there is no such thing as a temporary government program around here, or as Ronald Reagan said, it's the closest thing to eternal life is a temporary government program. This legislation will cost a lot more than they admit, and we now know how much that will be. Senator Graham, who serves as a ranking member on the Budget Committee, asked the Congressional Budget Office to provide a more accurate cost estimate for this legislation. Others, like me, asked the CBO and the Joint Committee on Taxation to give us an updated estimate. There's been a lot of requests made to come up with an accurate truth in advertising score for this huge bill. Last week, we got what we asked for. We finally received the true score for this legislation, and it's a whole lot more than the American people were told, and much more than they have bargained for. Let's start with the cost provision of just one part of this bill, the expanded child tax credit. This expansion initially came on the scene as a temporary measure in the first partisan spending bill just 9 months ago. So this actually builds on the $2 trillion our colleagues passed at the beginning of this year. The very first payments had barely gone out the door when our friends on the other side of the aisle had called for these temporary provisions to be made permanent. Our colleagues knew that a permanent expansion would have been far too expensive, so they opted for a temporary extension. Earlier drafts of this bill would have extended this policy through 2025. As time went on, the price tag was still too high, so Democrats scaled it back to a one-year extension, but still, nothing has changed. Calls to make this temporary provision permanent have not gone away, and I see no indication that our colleagues will ever be content to let this extension expire after just 1 year. Our colleagues on the other side of the aisle say this provision will cost taxpayers $185 billion, as if that were a bargain. The latest estimate from the CBO places the actual cost at roughly $1.6 trillion. You heard that right. Our colleagues across the aisle said it would just cost $185 billion, but the latest estimate from the Congressional Budget Office placed the actual cost during the 10-year budget window at roughly $1.6 trillion, 9 times higher than what Democrats had been telling the American people. The true cost of this one provision is nearly as high as what our colleagues said the entire package would cost. Then you add in the other higher than promised expenses, the true costs of payoffs and subsidies to organized labor. Allowing dues to become tax deductible will cost taxpayers billions more than advertised. But I'll give them credit about one thing. They are transparent when it comes to subsidizing more frivolous lawsuits against small businesses by giving a permanent tax cut to trial lawyers. But when you add up all of the not-so-temporary provisions, the Congressional Budget Office says this bill will cost $4.9 trillion during the first 10 years. Not $1.75 trillion, not zero, but $4.9 trillion. Deficits and debt would increase by a staggering $3 trillion. In other words, borrowed money that the next generation, or maybe next 2 generations, will have to repay. Which makes President Biden's comment about zero even more bizarre. When it comes to solving our country's biggest problems, our colleagues across the aisle have proven themselves to be a one-trick pony. Whether the American people are facing a pandemic, a sluggish economic recovery, red-hot inflation, or any combination of crises, President Biden and our Democratic colleagues here in Congress think trillions of dollars in new spending is the best path forward. The first round of reckless spending hurt our economic recovery and sent the American people on a wild inflationary ride. Our colleagues continue to ignore clear signals from the economy, including warnings by Democratic economists about the consequences to unchecked spending. And we're now experiencing the highest inflation in a generation. This second round of spending would usher in more inflation, higher deficits, and even a greater financial trouble for the American people. The American people have clearly suffered enough, and it's time to simply put the Build Back Bankrupt bill out of its misery. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Just under in honor of the holiday. Mr. President,
Senator from North Dakota.
are we in a quorum call?
Yes, we are.
I ask unanimous consent to eviscerate the quorum call.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman from North Dakota.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, as we approach the Christmas break and the advent of the new year, I believe it's instructive to take an inventory of the year that was. So in honor of the holiday season, let's take stock of the first year of the reign of Biden, Schumer, and Pelosi. In fact, in the spirit of the season, I'm going to call this recitation the 12 Biden blunders of Christmas. The first blunder that Joe Biden gave to us is a free big government socialist agenda, otherwise known as the Democrats' Build Back Better plan, designed to pass with no support from, or frankly, really input from any of these pesky Republicans. Time and time again, Joe Biden and his Democratic toymakers have parroted the claim that their big government socialist agenda costs zero. Zero, can you imagine? A piece of legislation designed to give away trillions of dollars but doesn't cost anything. But perhaps they have some elf dust that makes it possible. Obviously, this isn't true. Analysis by non-government, nonpartisan groups, including Penn Wharton Model and the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, did an analysis and concluded that the cost was much, much higher, like just under $5 trillion. A recent thorough analysis based on the history and the traditions of Congress and spending by the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office agrees. The Washington Post fact checker even gave Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen 2 Pinocchios when she repeated the same bogus claim that this bill would cost nothing. The second blunder Joe Biden gave to us is hiding from media reporters and not taking questions. It's kind of unbelievable to me. It's hard to imagine that the leader of the freest country in the world, in fact, the leader of the free world, is afraid to take questions from the Fourth Estate, or that his staffs are afraid of what might come out of his mouth. Mr. President, freedom of the press is enshrined in the First Amendment of our Constitution on purpose. Yet on David Axelrod's podcast, the White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki actually admitted out loud, quote, "A lot of times we say, don't take questions." The media in the United States is not supposed to be the mouthpiece of the government or its leaders. Transparency is essential in our exceptional self-governed system. Now, I'm not the President of the United States, but reporters who work in the halls of this temple of liberty, and of course, reporters back home in North Dakota, know I'm always willing to engage. I don't hide from my votes or explanations for them. I'm not scripted to the point of resigning my own thoughts or opinions, or even mistakes and decisions. No, North Dakotans elected me, not my staff. And Americans elected Joe Biden, not his staff, not some buffer of bureaucracy. He has the responsibility to be accessible, and the media has the responsibility to demand it of him. But the slippery slope doesn't end here. Now, the third blunder Joe Biden gave to us is the White House deciding what is, quote, misinformation. In a news conference, Jen Psaki said, "We're flagging," imagine this now, this is the White House spokesperson, "we're flagging problematic posts for Facebook that spread disinformation. We're working with doctors and medical experts who are popular with their audience with accurate information. So we're helping get trusted content out there." That's frightening language coming from a spokesperson for the president. It sounds an awful lot like the United States government colluding with the media to decide what, in fact, counts as fact. In fact, reading between the lines on this one, it seems the White House is playing the ultimate arbiter of truth. And if this seems a little Orwellian, well, it is. It is. And while it's easy to see why Ms. Psaki might conclude, and frankly other Democrats, that they, in fact, control a state media, the fact is they don't. Give the American people some credit here. They're smarter than being spoon-fed information from the West Wing through their elfin-folk at Facebook. The fourth blunder Joe Biden gave to us is raging inflation from pumping trillions of free dollars into the economy. We all saw the writing on the wall when Democrats and the Biden administration pushed for $2 trillion in, quote, COVID relief in March, just 3 months removed from the bipartisan $900 billion relief bill. This was a total partisan, reckless $2 trillion. It came at a time when there was obvious economic recovery coming out of the pandemic. And now Democrats want to spend nearly $5 trillion on their Build Back Broke plan. To put these massive numbers in perspective, the sum of these two bills, just these two bills, is more than the United States government spent fighting World War II. In 2019 dollars, the United States spent $4.69 trillion over the course of just under 4 years to fight and defeat Nazi Germany and the Axis powers. Liberal and left-of-center economists, including Larry Summers and Jason Furman, sounded warning bells early this year. But Democrats forged ahead, sending inflation to levels not seen in nearly 40 years. They continue to insist that inflation is transitory, but Americans know better. Americans paying more and more for everything with each passing month know this is more than transitory inflation. The fifth blunder Joe Biden's cabinet gave to us is Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas' assessment of the southern border crisis. Remember the hordes of illegal immigrants camping out under the bridge in Del Rio, Texas? Don't worry, Secretary Mayorkas said as he lowballed the numbers, citing approximately, I think, it's about $10,000 or 10,000 or so, 12,000. It could be even higher. Actually, conservative estimates have the tally upwards of 15,000 people. And while we're talking about the crisis at the southern border, it's important to note Joe Biden has made multiple claims that he's visited the border. But guess what? He hasn't. The Washington Post fact checker wrote, quote, "We cannot find evidence that Biden at one point made a visit to the southern border in his many decades of public office." It's as though he thinks if he says it, somehow that makes it true. The problem is lying doesn't make the lie true. I've been to the border, most recently about 6 weeks ago, and I can tell you it's bad, and I can tell you it's a crisis. Our Customs and Border Patrol agents are completely overwhelmed. I went on a ride-along and an aerial tour of the Rio Grande Valley and visited the Donna processing facility where families and unaccompanied minors are processed. If there's any takeaway from seeing this firsthand, it's this. There's no way to adequately understand the magnitude of the problem or the severity of the crisis unless you see it with your own two eyes. And so I implore the President, who has held elected office nearly uninterrupted since 1973, please visit the southern border and acknowledge what is obvious to everybody else. This is a national crisis. The sixth blunder Joe Biden gave to us is a new kind of border wall. Yeah, not the wall we need to secure the crisis on the southern border, which has seen record numbers as nearly 2 million people have attempted to enter the country illegally under Biden's watch. And by the way, this is just the number of illegal immigrants that have been apprehended by our CBP heroes. Now, that's more than twice the population of my home state. But according to Secretary Mayorkas, a border wall is an affront to, quote, get this, it's an affront to humanitarian relief. Obviously, the ranchers and the innocent American citizens living and working near the border don't qualify for this humanitarian relief. And yet, his agency secured and awarded a contract for nearly $500,000 taxpayer dollars to build and install a fence around Joe Biden's home in Delaware. What kind of humanitarian relief does Joe Biden's beach mansion need, Mr. President? The seventh blunder Joe Biden gave to us is our $450,000 settlements for illegal immigrants, just for being illegal. The Wall Street Journal was the first to report this absurd plan. While North Dakota families and businesses are struggling with inflation and skyrocketing costs on everything because of Joe Biden's spending policies, his administration wants to hand out hundreds of thousands of dollars to illegal immigrants. In comparison to the $450,000 proposed payout for illegal border crossers, the United States government pays only $100,000 to the families of soldiers killed in service to our country, and people who are wrongly accused and incarcerated in federal prison are eligible for just $50,000. That's right, $100,000 if you die defending our freedom, but $450,000 if you violate our freedom. Now, when confronted about this, President Biden said this was not going to happen, but he was quickly corrected by his own White House and the Justice Department. The negotiations are ongoing, so we don't know what any final number will be. I've helped sponsor legislation and amendments to prevent this policy from ever being implemented. The last thing we need is another incentive for people to come to our country illegally. The eighth blunder Joe Biden gave to us is private jet-setting climate apologist John Kerry's comments on coal. Kerry stated, and I quote, "By 2030 in the United States, we won't have coal. We will not have coal plants." While a State Department spokesperson walked back Kerry's statement, quote, "Noting the administration's plans still would allow coal, it's absurd on its face. Cutting off coal would shut down American innovation, kill all the progress we made on carbon capture technology, eliminate good-paying U.S. jobs, scrap grid reliability, and increase the cost of energy and everything that's produced that's dependent on the energy, like we need more inflation, and cede energy dominance to foreign adversaries who have a total lack of environmental concern and standards. Canceling coal is merely a transfer of emissions guilt to other countries with dirtier energy production than we have." The ninth blunder Joe Biden gave to us is moral authority and other gaffes from Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm. Most notably, Secretary Granholm, while in North Dakota no less, said, quote, "We don't have much moral authority to call out China when it comes to energy production and emissions. This is not just wrong, it's embarrassing. It's not just an intellectual mistake, it's an embarrassing gaffe. The stringent environmental and, I might add, labor standards of the United States are far superior to the lack of any of them in China, and I rest my case on the facts of the situation here. One, according to the BBC and several other agencies, but the BBC says China emits 27% of global emissions, and it's a rising percent, because it's a rising number, while the United States is around 10% and a declining percent. Two, according to the EPA, total U.S. energy-related carbon emissions fell by 12% from 2005 to 2018, while the United States became the #1 energy producer in the world. In contrast, global energy-related carbon emissions increased nearly 24%. So the United States reduces 12, the globe increases 24%. This is significant by any standard and certainly qualifies us to be able to say we have moral authority over China when it comes to polluting and greenhouse gas emissions. In North Dakota, in fact, we're performing groundbreaking research and piloting innovative demonstration projects. We're in the process of adding carbon capture technology to facilities like the Milton R. Young and Coal Creek power generation stations. Furthermore, the United States has invested more in clean energy research, development, and deployment than the next two countries combined. We're a global leader in climate mitigation measures for new energy sources, carbon management, and efficiency. The radical and backwards energy policy of this administration ignores American exceptionalism and the real progress that we've made as a nation. The Chinese Communist Party, Russia, and other polluters have shown no real interest in doing so. Yet Secretary Granholm and Joe Biden provide cover for them, along, of course, with John Kerry, even greenlighting their fossil fuel energy projects while they kill America's. The 10th blunder Joe Biden gave to us is a disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. There's a lot to unpack here, and nothing about this topic is meant to be glib or sarcastic. This withdrawal was nothing short of a tragic disaster and an international embarrassment. We will continue searching for answers and accountability from the administration on this, but let's focus on the failed commitments from Joe Biden. He said his administration would get all Americans and our allies out of the country ahead of his arbitrary August 31st withdrawal deadline. He also said the U.S. will stay in Afghanistan until all Americans who want to leave can do so. This is obviously not what happened. After the botched withdrawal, the administration listed numbers ranging from 85 people to 200 or maybe 400 Americans left in Afghanistan. The State Department, however, believes as many as 14,000 legal permanent U.S. residents remain in Afghanistan, according to a foreign policy press report. Whatever the number, Mr. President, the President went on national television and told the world this withdrawal was, quote, an extraordinary success. Mr. President, can you imagine being one of the people left behind and seeing your president on TV calling what he did an extraordinary success, saying that we got out successfully? It's abundantly clear there are significant numbers of U.S. citizens, residents, and important Afghan allies still stranded in the country, if in fact they're still alive at all. The 11th blunder Joe Biden gave to us is welcoming stiff competition with China. In October, Jen Psaki was asked about the Chinese Communist Party's hypersonic missile test, successfully circumventing the whole globe, which from reports indicate they're capable of delivering a nuclear warhead. Her response, oh, we welcome stiff competition. Really? Really? Why would the White House welcome military competition from our peer adversary, Communist China? As a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, it has been a priority to ensure the U.S. military maintains a secure and effective deterrent, a nuclear deterrent. In order to do so, we need to modernize our nuclear triad. America's nuclear triad of missiles, submarines, and aircraft are 60-plus years old in many cases, and they're not the same strong deterrent that our adversaries that they once were. It's clear and concerning the Chinese Communist Party is prioritizing a nuclear buildup, and the White House seems comfortable with all of this. The 12th blunder Joe Biden gave to us is the consistent confusion and alarm in regards to his own comments about Taiwan. In October, Joe Biden told reporters, quote, I've spoken with Xi Jinping about Taiwan. We agree. We will abide by the Taiwan agreement, he said. Of course, immediately alarm bells rang out, causing confusion and a lot of head scratching. You have to remember, we have a backdrop of Beijing ramping up military pressure on Taiwan, and Joe Biden can't properly articulate our nation's foreign policy posture. The lack of understanding on something as critical as China is dumbfounding. Taiwan is a strategic ally and important trading partner to the United States, especially given the increased risk China poses not only to the region, but to the world. If this was an isolated incident, it would be one thing. But this isn't the only time his comments on Taiwan had to be clarified. No. In a CNN town hall, Anderson Cooper interrupted the president to ask if Joe Biden was, quote, saying that the U.S. would come to Taiwan's defense if China attacked. Joe Biden promptly responded with, yes, we have a commitment. The White House resorted once again to walking back these comments in what seems to be a recurring occurrence at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. One Washington Post article wrote, quote, most analysts believe simply that Biden misspoke. Misspeaking is a kind way to dismiss the obvious lack of clear understanding of a critical foreign policy issue by our commander-in-chief. If there were to be an attack, I'm not even sure the president would know what to do if he can't accurately express what our policy is. Mr. President, I'm not sure I can sum this up as succinctly as two turtle doves and a partridge in a pear tree, but I can conclude that Joe Biden and his left-wing extremist allies deserve a lump of carbon-intense coal in their White House stockings this Christmas. I yield back. And note the absence of, I yield back.
At a school in Newtown, Connecticut, ages.
And a partridge in a pear tree. But
I had just done years ago this morning.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, 9 years ago this morning, I was in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I had just done an event with the city of Bridgeport. I was meeting my wife and, at the time, my two very young children, ages 4 and 1, in 2012 at the Bridgeport train station. We were going to take the train down to New York City, and I was going to show my two kids, Kathy and I were going to show our two kids the splendor of New York City. We were going to go see the Christmas tree. We were going to go to the ice rink. And as we were waiting for the train to arrive, I got news that there had been a shooting at a school in Newtown, Connecticut. Newtown's a beautiful community, quintessential small town, close-knit. The Labor Day parade every year attracts every civic and community group to it, the pride of the community. And I wondered whether I could still continue on to this family trip, or whether I needed to wait to find out more. I figured it was a disgruntled employee. A few moments passed as I waited for the train, and the news began to come in that this was much more grim, that there were children shot, perhaps many. And I decided that I should get in a car and head to Sandy Hook. There are a lot of days when I wish I didn't see the things that I saw or hear the things that I heard in Newtown that day. Senator Blumenthal, who's on the floor with me right now, he and I were there, and we were just witnesses. We were just interlopers. Neither of us lost a loved one that day. But it's a day that I will never, ever forget, etched into my brain. And we've come here likely every December 14th to memorialize another year having passed since Sandy Hook. And of course, at some point, you come to a loss for words. You can't figure out what new to say to your colleagues to try to explain what has happened to these families, to this community. Why there's such an aching for action, a disbelief that this country refuses to stand up and do something about the safety of our kids. Because, well, Newtown caught the nation's attention for good reason. 26 and 7-year-olds vanishing from the earth in an instant. Every single day, there are mothers and fathers who are losing children to gun violence that's completely preventable. A few weeks after Newtown, I was in a community center in the north end of Hartford with parents who were furious that the country was just waking up to this epidemic of gun violence after white children were shot in Newtown because it had been happening to their black children for decades. And so today, I want to do something very simple for my colleagues and for the country. I want to just explain to you what the grief of these families feels like, what it looks like when you lose a child, whether that child is 6 or 7 or 16 or 17. When you outlive your child, when your child doesn't even make it to adulthood, there is an all-consuming grief that is inescapable. One of the emotions that is connected to this grief that I've learned about is the tendency to deny the reality that has become your surrounding, and it's logical. To momentarily, either purposefully or subconsciously, try to figure out a way out of this world that you are living in without your child, without your son or daughter that you had planned to spend the rest of your life with. And so I want to talk a little bit about that emotion today. I live now in the south end of Hartford. I live just 2 blocks from the intersection of South Prospect and Sheldon Street. I think I live there intentionally because I know this story so well. And when my family and I were looking for a house in Hartford and there was one available just 2 blocks from this intersection, I think there was probably something intentional about the choice we made. On and at that intersection, just 2 months before the Sandy Hook shooting, Shane Oliver, a young African-American, 20 years old, was meeting a couple acquaintances. He was transferring a car that he had fixed up to this other group of individuals that he knew in passing. He was there with his girlfriend, and during the exchange of this vehicle, an argument broke out. It started because of something untoward that his sellers said about his girlfriend. It was essentially an argument over a girl that turned into a fist fight that then prompted Luis Rodriguez to go back to his car. Inside that car was an illegal gun. He walked out of the car with the gun. Shane Oliver tried to run, and he was shot in the back. He died that night at a Hartford hospital. His mother, for a good deal afterwards, would wake up in the middle of the night, awaken from a deep sleep, put her clothes on, get into her car, and start driving. She would do this night after night. She'd drive from her home to the corner of South Prospect and Sheldon Street, where her son died. And when she got there, she would shift her transmission into park, and she would turn on the high beams and just wait for hours. Car in park, high beams on, ostensibly waiting for her son to come back. It's implausible. Shane Oliver had died months ago. He wasn't coming back, but his mother, consumed by this grief, consumed by this need to deny what had happened, sat there in her car. Around the same time, one parent, who both Dick and I have gotten to know very well in Sandy Hook, came up with her own trick. She would pretend that her son, who had died that day in Sandy Hook, wasn't dead. In fact, he was just visiting a friend for the afternoon. She was trying to figure out ways to just get some housework done, to just tidy up the place, to make some phone calls that she needed to in order to get her family's business done. And the only way that she could do that was to imagine that her son was at a play date and that he would be coming home soon. And of course, that dream would vanish, and she would once again come to grips with the reality that her son was never, ever coming home. But that need to deny that reality, even for a few hours, was what was necessary for her in order to get through the day. I just tell those two stories because I want people to understand how desperate your life becomes when you lose a child. We lost 26 individuals, 20 kids and 6 educators 9 years ago today in Sandy Hook. And the families of all 26 of these individuals, the parents, the brothers, the sisters, the children, their lives will never, ever be the same. Newtown will never, ever be the same. Many of these kids lived within a block or two of each other. Everyone in Newtown knew one of these families, 2 of these families. Half of these kids all went to the same church. The funerals that we went to over and over again were at the same place with the same priest presiding over funeral after funeral, wake after wake. And so sometimes those of us who work in and around this issue of gun violence get angry at our colleagues because how can you listen to stories of this grief, and they happen in every state, and choose not to act? Lastly, I want to do something that I have done several times on the floor, because I am running out of ways to express what happened in Sandy Hook and why our inaction is inexcusable. I'm running out of turns of phrase to do it myself, and so maybe the words of a parent will help you understand why we need to act. So I'm going to read a few excerpts from testimony that our friend Neil Heslin gave before the United States Senate just 2 months after Sandy Hook occurred. Neil's a complicated guy. He's a good friend. He's had hard times in his life. But his best friend was his son, Jesse Lewis. And I'll end by reading what he wrote to the United States Senate 9 years ago. On December 14th, Jesse got up and got ready for school. He was always excited to go to school. I remember that day we stopped at Misty Vale Deli. It's funny the things you remember. I remember Jesse got the sausage, egg and cheese that he always gets with some hot chocolate. I remember the hug he gave me when I dropped him off. He just held me and he rubbed my back. I can still feel that hug. And Jesse said, "It's going to be all right." I mentioned that his father, Neil, had a rough life, had hard times like a lot of us. Jesse said, "It's going to be all right. Everything's going to be okay, Dad." Looking back on it makes me wonder, what did he know? Did he have some idea about what was about to happen? At the time, I didn't think much of it. I just thought he was being sweet. But he was always being sweet like that. He was the kind of kid who used to leave me voice messages where he'd sing me happy birthday, even though it wasn't my birthday. I'd ask him about it, and he'd just say, I wanted to make you feel happy. He had so much wisdom. He would know things, and I would have no idea how he knew, but whatever he said, he was always right. He'd remember things we'd done and places we had been that I'd completely forgotten about. I used to think of him as a tiny adult. Other people felt it too. Teachers would tell me about his laugh, how he made things at school more fun just by being there. Jesse had this idea that you never leave people hurt. If you can help somebody, you do it. That's what Jesse thought. If you can make somebody feel better, you do it. They tell me that's how he died. I guess we still don't know exactly what happened in that school. Maybe we'll never know. But what people tell me is that Jesse did something different. He heard the shooting and he didn't run and hide. He started yelling. People disagree about what he said. But 10 kids from my son's class made it to safety. I hope to God something Jesse did that day helped them survive. What I know is that Jesse wasn't shot in the back. He took 2 bullets. The first one grazed the side of his head, but that probably didn't stop him from yelling. The other hit him in the forehead. Both bullets were fired from the front. That means the last thing my son did was look Adam Lanza straight in the face. Jesse grew up with guns, just like I did. I started shooting when I was 8 years old. My dad was a vice president for years at the local gun club. He started taking me shooting when I was 8. He taught me to respect guns, just like I taught Jesse. Jesse had an interest in guns. He had a BB gun. I watched over him like a hawk with that. I taught him gun safety. He knew it. He could recite it to you. Some guns just don't have a place in the hands of civilians. The assault weapons we're talking about today, the sole purpose is to put a lot of lead out into the battlefield quickly. That's what they do. That's what they did at Sandy Hook Elementary. I wish I wasn't here with you today, Neil writes. The best day of my life was the day my son was born. The worst day was the day he died. I don't want to relive the day by talking to you here about it. It'd be easier for me to stay home. But I know that's not what Jesse would do. Jesse died screaming at a man with a gun. He died yelling at the top of his lungs so that maybe some of his classmates could get to safety. I'm not real political. Half the time I think it doesn't matter which group of you guys runs things here. No offense. I always thought it wasn't a real good idea for people to be walking around the streets with military weapons, but probably I wouldn't have said anything about it. So the reason I say this isn't about politics is because what I felt on that day and what I felt since doesn't have to do with politics. In politics, people like to debate and say that if we banned the weapon that Adam Lanza used, he'd just have found something else. But let me tell you, when you're sitting at a firehouse and it's 1 a.m. and you're hoping against hope that your son is hiding somewhere in the school, you want to make any change that makes it one bit more likely that you'll see your boy again. Before he died, Jesse and I used to talk about maybe coming to Washington someday. He wanted to go to the Washington Monument. When he talked about it last year, Jesse asked if we could come and meet the president. I said earlier that I can be cynical about politicians, but Jesse believed in you. He learned about you in school, and he believed in you. I want to believe in you too, writes Neil. I know you can't give me Jesse back. Believe me, if I thought you could, I'd be asking you for that. But I want to believe that you will think about what I told you today. I want to believe you'll think about it, and then you'll do something about it, whatever you can do, to make sure that no other father has to see what I've seen. Dick and I were at that firehouse all day and all night. And I'll never, ever forget that when all the parents had gone home, having told what happened, the first responders had almost all left. Sitting in the middle of the firehouse, all by himself, was this one man. It was Neil Heslin. I left that firehouse, I can't remember, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. Neil was the last person I talked to. And as he tells you in this testimony, he didn't leave until 1:30. If there was any chance that Jesse was coming back, that he was running around in the woods, Neil was going to be sitting there at that firehouse. It gets harder every year. And I have no personal stake in this. I went home that night to both of my kids who were sleeping safely in their beds. What the hell is going on in this country? That we sit here and memorialize year after year since those 20 kids died, and we don't do anything meaningful about it. Next December will be 10 years. And I'm just going to tell you how hard it will be for so many of these families to live through the 10-year mark of Sandy Hook with no action from this body. We have a year to get our act together here to make sure that in some small way we can honor these children with action. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, this day is one of profound emotion for both Senator Murphy and myself because we lived through that day, a searing, grief-stricken day that neither of us will ever forget 9 years ago. And at this moment, on that day, I stood before a church full of parents and members of that Newtown community. And what I said then was, the world is watching. The world is watching us and what we will do. And today we remember not only what we lost, but also what we still need to do. 9 years ago, those 20 beautiful children and 6th grade educators lost their lives. And today, as we did at St. Rose of Lima Church that evening, we remember the lives they lived. Their names will be forever engraved in our hearts. We remember them for bringing bursts of light and laughter, love into our lives, most especially into the lives of their families. We also remember the heroism, the real heroism of those educators on that day. 6 who bravely sought to shield their children, literally with their own bodies, sought to protect their children, running unhesitatingly toward that danger, barricading classrooms, drawing on all their reserves of calm and professionalism to protect children in their care. They were heroes. And so were the emergency responders, state police, all who came to the firehouse that day. I remember the broken faces, heartbroken faces of men who went into the school building to secure the crime scene and saw the bodies of children that could have been their own. Tough state policemen who'd seen it all. Those emergency responders, the ministers, the priests, people of faith who tended to parents, and yes, indeed, the parents themselves, heroes. My colleague, Senator Murphy, has talked about Jesse's dad, Neil Heslin. Jesse's mom, Scarlett Lewis, became a hero as a champion of social and emotional learning to try to prevent the conflict and the emotional travail that could lead someone like Adam Lanza to do what he did. And I will never forget, at one of those wakes and funerals that we attended in the days afterward, they seemed interminable in the cold and the deadening light of winter. One mom, whom I approached and said, "When the time is right, when you're ready, I think we should do something about gun violence." And she looked at me and she said, "I'm ready now." The ferocity, the bravery, the strength and fortitude of those parents in the days and months afterward, coming here as we sought to do something about gun violence, and then sat in the gallery when by a handful of votes we failed, and the cry of shame, shame, as one of those parents shouted to us. They worked bravely, and they have continued that work with the kind of unflinching courage that it takes every time they tell their story and every time one of the surviving families talks about their children in the quest to save others. That is what it's all about. That is why those brave parents, heroes of this story, have continued. For them, that December morning began like every other. They took their children to school, kissed them goodbye, maybe admonished them to be good that day. It was a normal day until it wasn't. And then time stopped for them and all of us. Time stopped, and the world changed forever, irreparably, irreparably. Changed forever for them and for all of us. And 9 years later, they live with that grief so far more deeply than any of us that it almost feels like an incursion on their privacy to talk about that day. And the scars of that day for them, but also for the brothers and sisters, for everyone who suffered a loss, that trauma and grief continue. And they relive it on this day. There also are heroes in that community of Newtown and Sandy Hook, a beautiful, quintessential New England town with such great spirit as they came together that evening at the St. Rose of Lima Church, and in the days and weeks and years afterward, with unyielding conviction and courage. And yet, we know that they are so far from alone, because in that time, incredibly, in the time, the 9 years since that day, 900,000 more people have perished. 900,000 more people have died from gun violence, and so many of them children. 1/3 of American children live in a home with a gun, and 3 million children are exposed to gun violence every year. Firearms are the leading cause of death among American children and teenagers, the leading cause of death for children younger than the age of 13. And so often they occur at home, outside the front door, in the neighborhood. Black children and teens, 14 more times more likely than white children and teens to die by gun homicide. There is a searing inequity and injustice here that radiates outside the boundaries of Sandy Hook or Newtown. It affects every community. None is immune. None is above gun violence. And because 60% of all deaths by gun violence are suicide, there are solutions here, like safe storage and emergency risk protection orders, red flag statutes that simply keep guns safely stored, like Ethan's law, or separate guns from people who say they're going to kill themselves or others, or give evidence that that's what they're going to do. The good news is we are seeing a new generation of leaders. We are seeing a political movement, not just a moment, a political movement, and a group of organizations that are mobilizing the vast majority of the American people who know we need to put an end to gun violence. Sandy Hook Promise, Newtown Action Alliance, Connecticut Against Gun Violence, Moms Demand Action, Students Demand Action, Giffords, Brady, March for Our Lives in the wake of Parkland. March for Our Lives, a new generation brought together by tragedy, united, regardless of their party, regardless of their other politics, they are together in demanding action. And with every one of these mass tragedies, Parkland, Las Vegas, Charleston, El Paso, Orlando, Pittsburgh, Atlanta, Boulder, Indianapolis, and now Oxford, Michigan. The scourge of gun violence has united these groups in a way that has never happened before, with the hope that Americans will express themselves not only in their neighborhoods and community meetings, but also at the ballot box, to hold us accountable, truly responsible for the complicity of Congress. Yes, it is complicity in that death and murder that occurs literally every day, more than 100 lives lost every day. There are real common sense solutions here. I don't need to describe them in detail. That will be for another day. Expanding background checks and closing loopholes in that background check system, keeping weapons of war and ghost guns off our streets, funding public health research and community violence intervention programs, protecting domestic violence survivors, setting standards for safe and secure storage, implementing those red flag statutes, and holding the gun industry and their nefarious partners accountable. We know what to do. We know what is necessary to help stop gun violence. There's no mystery here. And this movement, a political movement and social movement, can achieve it. But I want to talk not only about the grief suffered by families who have lost loved ones, but about the impact on the living, who may not even know about Sandy Hook. Children in schools right now, children who routinely do active shooter drills, diving under their desks or barricading their doors in anticipation of a mass murder in the place that should be safest to them. What will this generation think of schooling? What will this generation think of safety? Today, in some schools, there was no school because of the copycat threats phoned in to those schools. What kind of nation has to shut down schools because of the threat of mass murders? Not our nation, I would hope. Not our nation if we use our power to make our nation safer. Not our nation if we have the same kind of courage and guts and grit that those families of Sandy Hook had. We promise then to honor them with action. And we should keep in mind the grace and bravery of people like Kristen and Mike Song, who lost their son, a teenager, in a friend's house, to a shooting that was the result of an unsecured weapon. Unsecured because the parents of his friend failed to put it under lock and key. They made it accessible. Kids die like that every day, every week. And as our hearts break, we should remember the bravery of Kristen and Michael Song, who have crusaded for Ethan's Law, named after their son. They were here just last week at a vigil literally within a stone's throw of the Capitol, reciting their story, seeking to inspire us to act and take that step towards safe storage, taking nobody's gun away. These measures take no one's gun away. They just make it safe to own a gun and to save lives. We have children. I have 4 children. My colleagues on the floor have children and families. We remember those days when our kids were 6 years old. We remember the joy and light they brought to our lives. And there is a saying that no parent should outlive a child. Until we know someone who loses a child, but most especially at that age, the power of that saying may have less meaning. In 10 years, we should have done a lot more if we marked 10 years without doing more. In 10 years, next year at this time, we should hold ourselves accountable for doing more. Over this next year, we have work to do. And as dark as December may seem, it is also a season of light. And the heroism of those families, of the first responders, of the community of Sandy Hook should provide us with the inspiration we need to honor those brave and wonderful children, to honor them with action, not just words. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
The senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come to the floor today to honor an extraordinary public servant. It's my longtime legislative director, Bryn Stewart. He's going to be leaving the Senate after a 20-year career of working on behalf of the people of Wyoming. He served in this great institution under 2 different U.S. senators from Wyoming. He and his family have deep roots within our state, and he is a 3rd-generation Wyomingite. Bryn was born and raised in Sheridan, Wyoming. His father, Clyde, was a high school business teacher who also coached basketball and the golf team. His mother, Jerry, worked at the Sheridan Press, our local newspaper. Both of his parents encouraged him to work hard, to always be respectful, and most importantly, to be himself. Not to be what others expected him to be. Well, he has exceeded all expectations, Mr. President, I will tell you. Family means everything to Bryn. He's the 5th oldest of 7 children. And while it's Bryn's career that we're here to pay tribute to today in terms of his work in the Senate, his older sister, Kendall, was the first Stewart sibling to work in the United States Senate. She worked for Wyoming Senator Malcolm Wallop. She then came to work in my own office in Sheridan, Wyoming, in Bryn's hometown. It's also important to point out that Bryn's brother Dow also worked in the U.S. Senate. What a testament to Bryn's parents that so many of their children were committed to public service. Bryn took a very different route to the U.S. Senate than his siblings. After graduating from the University of Wyoming with a finance degree, Bryn went on to earn his law degree from the College of Law at the university in 1985. Turns out that Bryn wasn't the only standout from his class that year at the University of Wyoming School of Law. My fellow U.S. Senator from Wyoming, Cynthia Lummis, was Bryn's classmate in the law school, and the 2 of them remain great friends to today. After passing the Wyoming State Bar, Bryn has maintained his membership in the Wyoming Bar for 36 years. He moved to Gillette, Wyoming, and he started his career there as legal advisor to the Campbell County Sheriff and Deputy County Attorney. Now, I would point out that Campbell County and Gillette is the town where Mike Enzi, my former colleague, had been a representative in the legislature as well as the mayor. And Mike Enzi also had graduated, as has Bryn, from Sheridan High School. Well, 10 years later, Bryn became the Director of Administrative Services for the Campbell County Board of Commissioners. In that role, Bryn was able to balance the budget during a major economic downturn without laying off any employees. This was not an easy achievement. Now, after more than 16 years of serving the people of Campbell County, Bryn made the move to Washington, D.C. He came to D.C. to work for my predecessor, Senator Craig Thomas, as his tax and trade counsel. Now, the person who gets full credit for convincing Bryn to come work for the U.S. Senate wasn't Senator Thomas, it wasn't me. It's my incredible wife, Bobby Brown Barrasso, who encouraged Bryn to take the job and move across the country. Bryn fondly tells the story of how my wife, Bobby, who was then the state director of Senator Thomas at the time, in 2001, reached out to Bryn about the opportunity that really did change the course of his life and his career. Now, she knew that he would be a perfect fit for the job, and we're all very grateful to Bobby in so many ways, but most certainly for recognizing Bryn's talent and talking him into taking a leap of faith. Although it turns out a cross-country move wouldn't be the biggest shock of the journey for Bryn. I mean, it's a long way from Wyoming to Washington. But he was officially offered the job the Friday before the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Many people would have reconsidered moving to Washington, D.C. after such the largest terrorist attack in our country history. But Bryn didn't think twice. In fact, it only strengthened his resolve and his commitment to serve the nation and the people of Wyoming. Turns out he would need that resolve because during his first week in the D.C. office, the anthrax attacks occurred against our nation, against our Capitol, and against the Senate office building. Anonymous letters laced with deadly anthrax arrived in congressional offices, and Bryn, like so many staffers on the Hill, were displaced for months into temporary quarters. Despite the chaos and the rocky start, Bryn was not deterred, and he immediately jumped into his legislative role at full speed. For his first 2.5 years, Bryn served as counsel for Senator Thomas. He worked on numerous tax and trade bills. Most notably, he helped draft and pass legislation providing critical relief to drought-stricken livestock producers in Wyoming and across the country. Senator Thomas was so impressed with Bryn's work that he promoted him to be his legislative director in 2004. As you know, Mr. President, legislative directors have a very big job and lots of responsibility. They guide the entire policy staff in developing and implementing the senator's legislative agenda. As a result, legislative directors must be up to speed on all of the issues. Bryn recalls one story in particular from his early days as legislative director directly on this point. During the 2005 energy bill debate, Senator Thomas was selected to serve on the conference committee. A week into the committee meetings, Senator Thomas, then energy legislative assistant, was diagnosed with cancer. Never one to back down to a challenge, Bryn immediately stepped in. He quickly took over the reins, and he helped Senator Thomas successfully lead the fight for Wyoming coal and other important energy resources. Bryn recounts this experience as one of the highlights of his legislative career. Always ready to help, always ready to act. In 2007, when Wyoming and the Senate tragically lost Senator Craig Thomas to cancer, Bryn was central in supporting our entire staff, many of whom are on the floor today, through an extremely difficult and emotional time. And when I was selected to fill Senator Thomas's seat, I asked Bryn to stay on as my legislative director. It is a decision that I have never regretted. For more than 14 years, I've been incredibly fortunate to have his advice and his counsel. We've worked together on critical issues that will have a lasting and positive impact on Wyoming for decades to come. Now, this includes his great work in helping to pass the Craig Thomas Snake Headwaters Legacy Act, which was signed into law in 2009. Bryn was also instrumental in securing the return of Wyoming's abandoned mine land funds to our state, which is why I've always referred to him as our $100 million man. Now, these are just a few examples of the work Bryn is most proud of in his 20-year Senate career. Bryn's dependability and knowledge made him an indispensable member of my team. His work ethic and his dedication are legendary. He stays late, he works weekends, and he does whatever it takes to get the job done. We often joke in the office that Bryn is the first one in the ledge shop and the last one to leave. Doesn't matter if it's a blizzard outside or a global pandemic. Bryn is infamous for not letting anything keep him from doing the work in the Senate for the benefit of the people of Wyoming. Well, I've talked a lot about Bryn's professional accomplishment. I also want to highlight the ways that he continues to give back to the community and give back to others. He makes it his mission to live his life with a purpose. It's one of the reasons his priority is giving back to the community as much as he can. One of his biggest passions is supporting organizations focused on providing food and shelter to those in need. He serves as a member of the Salvation Army Board in his local community. He served in organizations that built homeless shelters, operate food pantries, and run low-income energy assistance programs. He's also a member of the Northern Wyoming Community College Advisory Board in Gillette that focuses on providing high-quality post-secondary education to the people in Campbell County and around Wyoming. Bryn's departure from the Senate leaves very big shoes to fill. And while we're all sad to see him go, we're happy to know he's moving back to where it all started for him, his hometown, Sheridan, Wyoming. He'll be closer to family. He'll also be able to spend time camping, hiking, and biking through his beloved Bighorn Mountains. Bryn, Bobby joins me along with our entire staff, many of whom are here on the floor, the current staff, but it is the past staff, the present staff, in commending you on a remarkable career of service. We're grateful that you chose to dedicate your life to helping make Wyoming and our country a better place to live and a better place to work. It is with admiration, appreciation, and respect that I wish you every success as you embark on this new adventure. And we're not just saying that because today is your birthday. You will be truly missed. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Ohio.
first I want to offer my congratulations to Bryn Stewart, and that was a beautiful speech about the public service that he has contributed to Wyoming and to the United States Senate. So I thank my colleague from Wyoming for that. Also want to say that over the weekend, I had the opportunity to travel to Kentucky. I live in Ohio, so Kentucky's our neighboring state, and went down to help some of our neighbors get back on their feet after these devastating tornadoes. And it was very emotional, partly obviously seeing people's lives just be devastated. So houses ruined and family heirlooms lost, and unfortunately some loss of life as the tornado hit some of the residential areas in western Kentucky. But also another emotion, which is gratitude for the people who came forward as volunteers to help, neighbor helping neighbor. As always happens when you have one of these natural disasters, the only silver lining is that people do come together, and providing water and food and help getting people out of their homes through urban search and rescue teams like Ohio Task Force 1, who went down to Kentucky, chainsawing trees down so that people can get their cars out and trying to repair some of the damage, get their lives back together. So it was a terrible thing to see the devastation, but also a wonderful thing to see people coming together to help one another to get through a tough time. I'm on the floor today primarily to talk about the legislation that has been proposed by the Biden administration and by the Democratic leadership. This is the 11th consecutive week that I've come to the floor to talk about this, because every week since it was introduced 11 weeks ago, I wanted to talk about what's actually in this legislation, how it would impact our communities, how it would impact our economy. So today I'm here to talk a little about some of the new numbers we have in terms of inflation and how this would impact inflation, and some of the new numbers that just came out since last week from the Congressional Budget Office, which is a nonpartisan group up here that analyzes these legislative efforts, and what they are saying about what the cost of this bill will be. So I think it's worth having this conversation before Congress, Senate, and the House vote on this massive tax bill, massive spending bill that could fundamentally change the way our economy works, and I think put us in a very difficult position as it relates to inflation and the economy and our debt and our deficit. Democrats want to push this through under what's called reconciliation, which is a special procedure here in the Senate, where instead of getting the normal supermajority of 60 votes, they could do it with only 50 votes and then have a tiebreaker be the vice president in her role as president of the Senate. So I have concerns about the substance of the legislation, but also in terms of the process. Wouldn't it be great if this could actually go through committees, and the committees could vet some of these proposals? Last week I talked about some of the tax proposals, for instance, which I think have inadvertent impacts on pensions, defined benefit plans in particular, inadvertent effects on businesses that aren't going to be able to write off expansions of plant and equipment, which we want them to do. Maybe some of these things were inadvertent, but it also has a change in the tax policy where it says that the state and local tax deduction would no longer be capped at $10,000. This is a federal deduction people were able to take for their state and local taxes, but they'd raise that to $80,000, that cap. The impact of that and a couple other things in the legislation means that 70% of millionaires, people that make over $1 million in income a year, would get a significant tax cut under this legislation. Whereas if you only make $30,000 a year, only 30% of those people get a tax cut. And that's in the first year. And in the second year, it goes down to about half that. And in the third year, it goes down to 10% and below. So it really is skewed toward providing tax relief for the wealthy at a time when, obviously, we're concerned about those people, given the economic uncertainty, given the COVID issues, given the natural disasters, given the other issues that we face. You would want to help those who need the help the most. That's not what this legislation does. And again, if it had gone through the process of the committees of jurisdiction, in this case the Finance Committee, Ways and Means Committee, I don't think we'd be seeing this. All these issues are ones that could have been ironed out had it not been jammed through on this reconciliation process without any committee consideration. So I'm upset that Congress is being thwarted from doing its work. And I think if we had, it would be a very different piece of legislation. This plan is also going to hurt, in my view, with regard to inflation. We're looking at the highest inflation we've had in decades. I think everybody knows that now, not because they're looking at the numbers, which I'll talk about in a second, but because when they go to the grocery store, they're paying a lot more for a hamburger or for milk or for bread. Or when they go to fill up their car with gas, they're seeing the prices at the pump. I filled up my pickup truck. I took it to Kentucky on this trip I just talked about, and it was almost $100 to fill it up. That's a lot for people who are on fixed income, or young people, or someone that's got to commute to work. That really takes a bite out of your budget. But that inflation is across our economy right now, and it's tough on people. The work shortages that we see, the workforce shortages, the supply chain delays, the inflation, all these things are problems in our economy right now. All of them get worse, in my view, if we do it the way the Democrats propose, because by adding more fuel to the fire, more stimulus spending, in this case, trillions of dollars, you're going to stimulate more demand in the economy. And inflation happens when demand outstrips supply. So you have a lot of demand for something, but you don't have the supply for it, and it raises inflation. And that's exactly what many of us predicted would have happened back in March of this year when Congress did the same thing, $1.9 trillion. A lot of it was stimulus spending. And people said this is going to cause inflation, and sure enough, it did. And it wasn't just me and other Republicans, it was some Democrats as well. So that trend of rising inflation, which has made things so costly and expensive for so many people in my home state of Ohio, shows no sign of slowing down. Late last week, the Labor Department reported the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, rose by 6.8% over the last 12 months. That is the biggest year-to-year inflationary increase in 39 years. 39 years. And last month, the number for inflation, 1 month alone, was 0.8%. So get on your calculator, do the math. 0.8% in 1 month, do that times 12 months, you end up with inflation of 10% on an annualized basis. That's just from last month. If you just extrapolate that out over the year, 10% inflation? For those who lived through inflation in the late 1970s, early 1980s, you know what that does to your economy. So the notion that the Biden administration has this is going to be temporary or transitory, that's just not true. And by the way, the Federal Reserve has now said that's not true. It's going to be here for a while. Although we're hearing a lot of stories these days about businesses paying higher wages to attract workers, average wages went up by 4.3% last year. So with all the labor shortages and the increase in wages went up 4.3%. Again, inflation went up 6.8% in the same 12-month period. So this is why if you're getting a raise at work, you feel pretty good about it, getting the raise, but then you go to the grocery store or go to the gas pump or buy some clothes, you don't feel so good about it. It's because your inflation is higher than your wage gain. So unless you're wage gain is over 6.8% over the last year, on average, you're losing out. And that's a real problem. By the way, in 2020, as we got into the COVID-19 crisis, we had a very different economy. In February of 2020, we had the 19th straight month of wage gains of 3% or more, and inflation was, 1.5%. So people were feeling it, which was, hey, I'm making more money, and it's not being eaten up by inflation. That's not the case now, unfortunately. Wages aren't keeping pace with these higher prices, and people are finding their paychecks just don't go as far as they used to. We can see by some data that just came out from a survey of consumer expectations from the New York Fed that an increasing number of people are reporting that they're struggling more financially than they did a year ago. That's from the Fed, the New York Fed. And fewer are expecting their financial situation to improve by this time next year. That's not a great feeling as we approach the holiday season. That's a real concern. The other report we've had since I was on the floor last week is with regard to the producer price index. We talked about the consumer price index. The producer price index is about businesses. What are businesses seeing in terms of inflation on business-to-business purchases, for instance? The new number out this week on that is the largest increase year over year since we started keeping track of this number, which is about 11 years ago, 12 years ago. So the producer price index is also going up, and the consumer price index is already up. What this means is that that producer price index number is eventually going to be reflected in higher consumer costs, right? Because businesses are going to pass that along. So this is not a good week because we just got that data, and I was very sorry to see it, because what you want to see is that producer price index going down, meaning that in the future the consumer prices are going to go down too. Instead, we're seeing a situation where it's likely that prices are going to keep going up. Again, Republicans warned of this when the $1.9 trillion was spent, mostly to stimulate the economy, saying this is going to overheat the economy, more demand, less supply, partly because of COVID. In other words, COVID made it harder to get supply in. Demand was up. You're going to have inflation. Sure enough, it's what happened. Larry Summers is the former Secretary of the Treasury under President Obama, former chair of the National Council of Economic Advisors. Actually, he was Treasury Secretary for President Clinton, chair of the National Economic Council for President Obama, respected economist. He too warned of this. So it's not just a partisan issue, not Republicans and Democrats, it's the reality. What's happening when you increase demand much more than supply can handle? You get inflation. So it's not a surprise that it happened. Unfortunately, his prediction came true. Overheated economy, demand outstripping supply. We found ourselves in this spiral of rising prices. That was 9 months ago. I think it's fair to say that the inflation that people said was transitory is going to stay here for a while. That's a real cause for concern. So why are we doing this? Why are we, again, spending trillions of dollars? And what is the cost? Something that happened since we talked last week is that the true cost of the Build Back Better plan is now being revealed by this group on the outside from the University of Pennsylvania, the Wharton School, by the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, by others, but now by the Congressional Budget Office itself. So the Congressional Budget Office is the nonpartisan group up here in Congress who tells us what the fiscal impact is, spending impact, taxing impact is, economic impact is of legislation. And, the number that has been cited for the cost of this Build Back Better legislation is $1.7 trillion over 10 years. That's a lot. That would make it the second most expensive bill ever passed by Congress, the first being the $1.9 trillion we talked about in March. But it's worse than that, because it turns out that even those staggeringly high costs we just talked about, $1.7 trillion, misses the mark based on the analysis that just came out. Just as the prices for everyday goods and services are going up, the estimates we're seeing for the true cost of Build Back Better are increasing every analysis we see. These studies have shown us that because the legislation sunsets programs, that if you actually assume those programs are not going to be stopped after, let's say with the child tax credit, 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, but you continue through the life of the legislation, it's going to be much more expensive. And so people tell me, well, Rob, that's fine, but the child tax credit, as an example, only costs $185 billion only. And I say, well, actually, if you take it out over time, that becomes trillions of dollars, like $1.6, $1.7 trillion. And they say, well, we're just going to do it for 1 year. Well, that's just not what happens here in Congress. I mean, the history of this is that once we put a program like that in place, it continues to live on year after year. Let me give you the best example of that. You have probably heard a lot of Democrats saying over the past few weeks, we have to pass this Build Back Better legislation by the end of this year. Why? Because the child tax credit that's already in law based on the March legislation is expiring. So there's a tremendous amount of pressure, right? They're saying you have to extend it. Well, that makes our case. So you have to extend it this year. That means, I assume, you have to extend it next year, and the next year, and the next year, and the next year. Anybody who says that they don't want to extend it on the other side of the aisle, I'd like to hear from them, because I don't think they're going to say that. And so if you assume it's extended, then you have this huge cost. The spending is going to continue to increase, and the program's not going to sunset. The total cost of the bill goes from $1.7 trillion we talked about to about $4.5 trillion based on the Penn-Wharton study I talked about. Under the Congressional Budget Office analysis, it actually goes even higher to $4.9 trillion. And when you add interest on the debt, it goes actually over $5 trillion. So it's difficult to understand these numbers we're talking about because they're so huge. You know, $4.5 trillion is $4,500 billion. We've never spent this kind of money before. I mean, if it's $5 trillion, that's the size of our budget, or less, the whole budget for the entire country for a year, in one bill. Now, people say, well, it's paid for. Well, it's the 1.7 part, you could argue, is paid for, although we can talk about that too, because some of the things in the pay-fors are not sustainable in my view, including, again, the impact on pension funds, or the impact on being able to write off investments, or the impact of the SALT issue. So there's lots of things that need to be worked out on the spending side, but also on the revenue side. But let's assume it's 1.7 trillion, but that's not going to cover it because you've got these expenses like the child tax credit that will continue. So I'm glad that my colleague, Senator Lindsey Graham, who's ranking member of the Budget Committee, top Republican, and Senator John Cornyn, another colleague, asked the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office to do their analysis because they showed that without the sunset, the 10-year cost of the child tax credit goes from $185 billion to $1.6 trillion. They also found that, in line with another study by the nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation, that the revenue loss would be $1.6 trillion, either taking us further into debt by $1.6 trillion or requiring new tax hikes. So that's just one part of the legislation. It would be the costliest expenditure by Congress in our history, but it's just one part of the legislation. The hundreds of billions in funding Democrats are proposing as an example for child care under a new approach to child care, which we can also talk about the substance of that, but it's going to hurt a lot of our states, the way they're doing it. But that'll end up costing double the written amount over the next decade if they remain in place, for example. So all in all, the Congressional Budget Office looked at 18 supposedly sunset social spending programs and found that they will end up costing the taxpayers nearly $3.5 trillion over the next decade when they get extended, if they do. And again, the history around here is that they would. So, you know, it's just the price tag goes up and up and up. When you add that spending to another program in Build Back Better, CBO says the total spending in the legislation goes, again, to $4.9 trillion. By the way, $4.9 trillion is bigger than the economy of any country in the world, with the exception of the US, China, and Japan. Again, these numbers are just astronomical. But think about that. It's bigger than the entire economy, the entire GDP of any country in the world except for the three of us, United States, China, and Japan. We're seeing record debts and record deficits right now, as you know. The Congressional Budget Office says that the American people can expect Build Back Better, if the sunsets don't hold, to add another $3 trillion to the federal deficit. So as we continue to debate this in Congress, which way should we go, we just ought to know these numbers. We ought to analyze them. And again, if people on the other side of the aisle are going to say we don't want to have the child tax credit be extended, we need to know that. But my sense is, just as they want to extend it right now, they would want to extend it next year, and the next year, and the next year. So is this the right time to do that? Is this the right time to add that kind of stimulus to an economy that already is overstimulated, where you got more demand chasing not enough supply? Do you want to add more to the demand side? That's what's going to happen if we pass this. So I hope that we will not make that mistake. I hope that we will slow down and look at these numbers and analyze where we are in terms of our spending. We just extended the debt limit. No Republican voted for it, but all the Democrats voted for it, and that's all they needed to be able to extend the debt limit because it was under a special 50-vote margin. That debt limit was just extended for basically 1 year, so after the elections next year. $2.5 trillion more debt. We had to make room for $2.5 trillion more debt in 1 year. It's clear that a lot of Americans are nervous about this. When you look at the polling data, it says that, but just talking to people. Over the weekend, I was also in southeast Ohio, part of our state. It's very rural. A lot of people are hurting in terms of the economy because they don't have access to broadband and so on. So we were talking about how they feel about the economy, and there's a lot of nervousness. They feel the surging inflation. They're paying more for everything. And, you know, common sense, people are saying, let's just slow down and think about this. They may end up thinking at the end of the day they're for some of this, but they don't want to move forward precipitously and make a mistake and have this add more inflation and more problems for our debt and deficit for our kids and grandkids. They're saying, let's do the right thing for the country and put the brakes on this. And if we do put the brakes on this unprecedented spending and taxing, it will help us to avoid some of these economic challenges that we're otherwise going to be facing. If we go ahead with it, it's going to make these economic challenges, like inflation, even worse. So my hope is that we'll put the brakes on and these economic challenges will not worsen, and instead we can get the country back on the right track. I yield the floor.